Good evening. And I don't know where my page turner went, but she she will come out eventually. Um, Tonight, okay, you want to use those lights? We can do that too. Uh, there might be a little lighting confusion going on here, but anyway, tonight, uh, Mark N. will be discussing Percy Grainger, born in 1882, died 1961, an Australian pianist, composer, and innovator, and a fascinating fellow, as you will find out. Mark Grant himself is a pianist, composer, innovator, and writer, having written two books, one called The Rise and Fall of the Broadway Musical, and previous to that, a book called Maestros of the Pen, and a very great scholar of Percy Grainger. Without further ado, Mark Grant.
So, you see a picture before you, and I think you probably all recognize the man on the right. The question is, who is the man on the left? I had the opportunity, I'm a composer and a writer and a pianist, as Joe explained, but I've also been involved with the legacy of Percy Grainger since the 1970s. And I'm going to be talking about my experiences, knowing some of his friends. I was on the board of the Grainger Society for about 35 years. I'm going to be playing a number of his works that he wrote and works that he made arrangements of other composers, and I'm going to dissect some of the examples of his pianistic ingenuity in each piece, after each piece. And I'm going to show you quite a number of photographs to illustrate this and people that I knew and experiences that I had. But you should know that not only did I live in Percy Grainger's house, in a manner of speaking, I mean, I was a long-term, part-time house sitter, and the gentleman who was the full-time house sitter that I substituted for, his widow is here tonight, Elizabeth Lewis. How are you? Thank you for coming. Thomas Lewis was the main house sitter. But I am the only living person, I believe, who was treated in a hospital by Grainger's personal physician. Now, Grainger died in 1961, 61 years ago. Am I 110? Not yet. But what happened was that I actually grew up in White Plains during the late Jurassic era. And I came home from college one summer, had a new bicycle, took it out for a spin. Nobody wore helmets on bicycles in those days. And went down the street, and the gear sprockets locked, and I was thrown all over the handlebars and hit my head and smashed it open. And I was bleeding, and to make a long story short, I was taken to the emergency room of the White Plains Hospital. And a nurse greeted me there and said something like, "Young man, you're in luck today, because our retired chief of surgery is with us today. He's making the rounds of the emergency room." Yeah, okay, you know, I'm bleeding, I'm faint, and whatever. So in comes this kindly doctor who sewed me up, and I had to go back to see a wonderful bedside manner. I had to see my eye was completely swollen shut for 3 days. I had a hematoma. And I had to go back to see him on another day to have the sutures removed. And who was that man? He's the man on the left in the photograph with Percy Grainger. His name was Dr. Kåre K. Nygaard, Norwegian, Kåre K-A-A-R-E. This picture was taken about 15 or 20 years before I had my experience, sometime in the 1950s. And I re-encountered Dr. Nygaard in 1978 when I first visited the Grainger house. And at that time, all of the board members, Ella Grainger was still living, his widow. And most of the board members had known Percy personally. It wasn't that many years since he had died. And Dr. Nygaard was there. And he didn't remember me, but in short order, he invited me to his home for dinner. He wanted to tell me things about Percy Grainger. And on May 24th, 1978, I went to his house in Scarsdale, and his wife had died recently. Her name was Ella, as was Percy's wife, Ella, which I'll get to in a moment. And Dr. Nygaard was also an accomplished sculptor, and he had a whole studio in his house full of his sculptures and busts. He'd done one of Percy. And he showed me a cast of Abraham Lincoln's life mask, which just was completely arresting. We can all see photographs of life masks of famous people online. It's not the same thing. It's not something you can experience virtually. You have to be there to experience the effect of it. And so I had a bit of an acquaintance with him. He gave me some notes that he was giving to Percy's biographer. And of course, you know, you just think of it. You crack your head open, you're bleeding like a stuck pig, you race to the emergency room of the hospital, you know, half passed out, and the doctor is suturing you, and then he says, hey, why don't you come over for dinner sometime? You know, it doesn't happen every day. It didn't happen exactly that way. But, so I'm going to go through a couple of photos here. Dr. Nygaard, I should say, didn't meet Percy until Percy was sick with cancer. In 1953, he had cancer. He didn't know it. They didn't tell him. But Dr. Nygaard had been a fan of Percy in his native Norway when Percy played there. And he seems to have assisted Percy in some way financially. I don't know if he waived his medical fees. There was no Medicare in the 1950s. Percy had many operations, and Nygaard referred him to some other doctors for some of them and did some of them himself. He was a surgeon. I don't know if he was an intern medicine specialist as well, but he guided Percy's care until Percy's death in 1961. Here's another picture of them, again from the mid-1950s. Dr. Nygaard looked older when I knew him. And this is, admittedly, a little bit of a dim picture. This is from the mantel at 7 Cromwell Place in White Plains, which is where Percy lived for 40 years from 1921 to his death in 1961. And that's his life mask on the right side. And on the left is a picture of him as an older man. As I said, it's much more arresting in person. So I just want to put Grainger in context with some other musical dignitaries. When Grainger died, his music was in eclipse. He was fairly obscure. But in 1966, Benjamin Britten brought out a record called Salute to Grainger, in which he himself had performed with Peter Pears and some other assisting musicians, several Grainger works, and that began to kick off a revival. And on Percy's trip to England in 1958, he had met Britten, and the very last work for orchestra that Benjamin Britten wrote, the Suite on English Folk Tunes, Opus 90, he dedicated, quote, lovingly and reverently, close quote, to Percy Grainger, which is the same phrase that Grainger put on many of his scores addressed to Edvard Grieg, whom Grainger had known when he was young. And the Britten Suite on English Folk Tunes doesn't sound too much like Grainger, but it has the same tune, or one of the same tunes, Lord Melbourne, that is in Grainger's band masterpiece, Lincolnshire Posy. And the year after Percy died, the wife of Henry Cowell, the composer Henry Cowell, some of you may know, avant-garde composer, wrote a wonderful memorial tribute to him in the Journal of Folk Music. And she said, I first met Percy Grainger about 1938, and he was a radiant person, ineffably courteous in conversation. He was the special foe of one-sided or oversimplified statements and could be depended upon to point to both white and gray areas in any situation that one had ventured to suppose was black. It is impossible to write of him now without expecting that quiet voice to offer smilingly behind one's shoulder the contrary aspects of all that had been said. He was a great contrarian. He was a vegetarian, but whenever interviewed, he would proclaim, I hate vegetables. And there's another line here. Grainger was not only a great composer and pianist, he was also highly original intelligence, peculiarly highly gifted personality, among other things, a linguistic genius who spoke and wrote a variety of languages. Though he only stayed in Denmark for brief periods, he spoke and wrote Danish in beautiful and personal style and mastered Norwegian and Swedish. Percy thought he was an honorary Scandinavian. Where's my program here? So Henry Cowell had actually lived with the Graingers. Some of you may not know, but Henry Cowell was convicted on a quote-unquote morals charge in the 1930s when he had had relations with a young boy, different time, different mores, and he was sentenced to 15 years in San Quentin prison in California, of which he spent 4 before he was paroled. Sorry, I have a little hoarseness today. And Percy was among those people who vouched for him at his parole and got him released. And he came to live with Percy and Ella at 7 Cromwell Place for the year 1940. And the room where he lived is they now call the Henry Cowell room. And he worked as Percy's secretary, and Percy helped get him back on his feet. He paid him the equivalent of about $1,000 a month in $22, plus free room and board, and eventually they went their separate ways. But they had a long friendship, and Henry Cowell was one of the last people to visit Percy before Percy died in 1961. Now I'm wearing, not exactly formal wear, but to celebrate Grainger as a green man, the great British musicologist Wilfred Mellors said, reaffirming the values inherent in unwritten music, Grainger speaks for the health of the minds and bodies of common folk. In that sense, he was a green artist before greenness had been invented, or at least named. That's why I'm, well, blue-green. And Vaughan Williams was also a visitor to Cromwell Place in White Plains a couple of times. And after he visited Percy there in 1954, one of the movements of Vaughan Williams' 8th Symphony featured a large percussion section, which was very typical of Percy's own writing for the orchestra. So it seems to have been an influence. Now, unlike every other pianist in this series, I don't play the piano for a living. I'm a writer, I'm a composer, and I'm putting on my pianist hat tonight. It's a kind of a rumpled hat. But as unaccustomed as I am to publicly tickling the ivories, no, that sounds indecent. The only thing indecent here will be my pianistic inadequacies, but I hope you'll bear with me. And I have a testimonial from Grainger in that effect. When he was a student in Frankfurt, Germany in the late 1890s, Percy went to see Eugene d'Albert, the pianist, or Eugen d'Albert. He was an Englishman who became a confirmed German, and he was a great pupil of Franz Liszt and considered one of the great pianists of the era. And Percy, in later years, wrote of d'Albert's pianism, I was enthralled by his slapdash style, English style. When I saw d'Albert swash around the piano with the wrong notes flying to the left and right, and the whole thing a welter of recklessness, I said to myself, that's the way I must play. I'm afraid I learned his propensity for wrong notes all too thoroughly. So I have a warranty from the composer. It's okay to swash around and mess up. It's idiomatic. I must say that Percy made about 6 hours of commercial recordings, and they're pretty clean. But there are a lot of private recordings, air checks from radio broadcasts, concerts that happened in the boondocks that have turned up over the years. And there are also recordings that were made at home. So I have in my ears hours and hours of his sound, including recordings that were made when he was just rehearsing things at home. So I have a pretty good idea. Anyway, and this piano belonged to the pianist Gina Backauer. And I was once in the room with Gina Backauer, in a manner of speaking. In 1975, she gave a master class at Manhattan School of Music, and I was there. And there was a young man who played, and when he was finished, the moderator of the master class, I don't remember who that was, asked Madame Backauer if she wanted to say anything. And all she said was, nothing, bless him. And it was just such a benign and gracious thing to say in master classes. Usually there's some crypto-sadism involved between the teacher and so wherever you are now, Madam Backauer, please bestow blessing on me, because I need all the help I can get. Now, I'm going to run through some other photographs here. Now, this photograph was taken May 1st, 1978, in the music room at 7 Cromwell Place in White Plains, Percy Grainger's home. Ella Grainger, his wife, is in the middle. It was her 89th birthday. To the left is Inez Bull, who was a singer and a pianist, and to the right is the composer Ronald Stevenson, who was a great Grainger enthusiast. He never met him, but he corresponded with him so abundantly that their correspondence was later published in a book. And Ronald gave a recital the day before. Ella at that time was a little challenged. She had had a stroke not very long before that, and she didn't see too well and didn't hear too well. But she became very alert when the photographer showed up and said, "Oh, I don't look good," and she was very lucid. And so we caught at least that, and that's an inset. That photograph above was taken around 1925 of Percy, and it was blown up larger than life. Inez was an interesting character. She published this book, a loving tribute to 7 Cromwell Place, but she made some peculiar claims. She was sort of, she kind of came out of George S. Kaufman and Moss Hart's play, You Can't Take It With You, in a way. She had taught developmentally challenged children, and she claimed that the 1963 film A Child Is Waiting, with Judy Garland playing a teacher of such children, was based on her life. There was no evidence of that, and she claimed to be a descendant of the 19th century great Norwegian violinist Ole Bull, spelled Ole Bull, but not in the sense of a matador in a cape. It's thought that she was distantly related, if at all, to Ole Bull, but nevertheless, she was a charming lady. And some of you may know that Ronald Stevenson composed a famous 90-minute solo piece for the piano called Passacaglia on DSCH for Dmitri Shostakovich. There's a new recording of it by the young pianist Igor Levit. And so he was a formidable pianist. And to start the musical portion of what we're going to do, I just want to make sure I'm following my own script so I don't become lost. I want to show some more photographs before I get to that. Okay. Now, the man to Ella's left, or your right, is Stuart Manville, who married her some years after Percy died. And Stuart was the doyen of the Grainger house and the maitre d' of the Grainger house until he died in 2018. There's Ronald Stevenson again at the piano, same day. Now, this is Ronald with the pianist Edward Weiss. who was a student of Ferruccio Busoni. And you have to factor in that Busoni died in 1924, and this picture was taken in 1978. And I was right there. In fact, I hired the photographer, even though I was, the junior member of the group, but I wasn't a board member yet. I was a guest. And Edward Weiss used to call me on the telephone. I gave him my business card, and he considered an old world calling card. People would actually call you up 100 years ago in Europe or wherever, and he would reminisce about all the pianists he had seen in the early part of the 20th century. He was involved with the Liederkranz Society in Manhattan and the concerts they gave for many years. So he was quite a character, and one anecdote he told me about Percy Grainger was that he had gone to a concert that Grainger had given rather late in life, and went backstage to greet Percy. And Percy turned to Ella, his wife, whom you saw in the other photograph, and said, "Ella, it's Weiss, the Frisian." Frisian being from Friesland, which was a district that was part, I believe, in Netherlands, and part in Germany on old maps, and it has a certain ethnic and national heritage. So Grainger was very ethnic-minded, and this has given rise to some possibly distorted conceptions about some of his views, but that's a subject we can get to later. After the musical portion, we're going to have a interview with, Joe will ask me questions, and we might have a Q&A, so stick around for that. Now, that's Stuart and Ella about the same year. You can see she was an old lady, but I want you to see the next picture to see what she looked like in her prime. She was quite a beautiful lady, and in fact, had some serious romantic involvements before she met Percy Grainger. She had a child out of wedlock, whom I will describe later on, and she had a long affair with a conservative member of the British Parliament named Leverton Harris, who was old enough to be her father, but kind of supported her when she was going to the Slade Art School in London in the 1910s. And she was a talented painter and a ceramics artist, and did poetry as well. And so she was a great beauty, and that's another picture of her in her youth. And in fact, when she came down to I must have been in the room with her a dozen times in the last 18 months of her life. And she didn't know who I was, but we had a few words where she was lucid. She would lapse into Swedish, and she had her friends, Swedish friends who could speak with her. And I understood later on that she was a very intelligent, educated woman. I read a lot of her correspondence. Anyway, she died in July 1979. Wait, I'm going ahead too fast. There she is with Stuart Manville, whom she married. That's from their wedding day in 1972. And now we have Ella, Percy, and another important man in Percy's life, Burnett Cross, whom I got to know very well, and who collaborated with Percy on the project of his old age, so-called free music, when he had cut back from concertizing and he was dealing with cancer. And he created all of these homemade instruments in his house to create gliding and glissando sounds. It's really another topic beyond the purview of this evening, so I'm only going to touch on it. But Burnett was somebody I spoke to regularly for years. He passed away in 1996, and he was a keeper of the flame and told me all sorts of things about Percy. And there's Ronald Stevenson again on the harmonium, the reed organ in the Grainger house, which has recently been rehabilitated. Percy was very fond of playing the reed organ. He thought that it had a special musical quality and ensembles that would kind of bind all of the other instruments together smoothly, so he often put it in his orchestration. And there is a picture of Percy playing the harmonium, an early picture from probably the 1920s. Let's see, that's the way it looks today after being restored. Or it may look a little better than this. That was before it was restored. Okay, let me take a look at my okay, so I want to say a few remarks in general about Grainger's piano music before I get into it. First of all, most of his writing for piano solo originated in his own orchestral or chamber pieces that he then rearranged for the piano instead of the other way around. I mean, with Ravel and Stravinsky, for instance, they usually wrote the pieces for the piano and then orchestrated them. So Grainger composed relatively few pieces originally for the piano medium. And that has everything to do with the way he lays out the notes for the player. You know, we forget that Liszt, for instance, did an orchestration of the Mephisto waltzes before he wrote them for the piano. And Grainger also liked to arrange his works for two pianists, four hands at two pianos, sometimes two pianists, four hands at one piano, and sometimes three pianists, six hands, two at one piano and one at a second piano. So he was a master of that. Another thing is that his textures are largely chordal, but at the same time, they're very horizontally and polyphonically conceived in design and expression, and often with very unconventional arpeggiation. I call it piano strumming, and that's something that he did. And I mean, pianists at that era all did that a little bit. You know, they weren't purists, but when you hear Percy's recording of the Chopin A-flat prelude, he strums the left-hand part. It's just block chords in the score, and he rolls it. So it was just something that did. By the way, Bartók did that also. Bartók was a fabulous pianist, and if you listen to some of his recordings of his own piano music, he deviates greatly from the printed engraved score. He rolls chords. There are all sorts of changes in the Gajic accents. Grainger played his own stuff pretty much straight, and but not without expression, obviously. But you can almost set a metronome to some of his versions. And he never wrote in the sonata form. Everything was in either through composed or in variations of dance or ballad tunes. He wrote Passacaglia, and his writing makes strenuous demands on the pianist's finger and hand strength. And the keyboard texture changes a lot. You're called upon to jump around to different ranges because they're basically where the notes were in the orchestral version that he made a reduction from. And he just reproduces that in the piano version. And sometimes you have to practically hit the piano, and other times it requires extreme finesse, and he writes a chord where there are different dynamics for different notes within the chord. He'll draw a comic strip balloon and point to a note in the middle, say MF, and the top note will be MP, and so that requires. He had a large hand. He had a hand that could span an 11th, and I mean, I have a medium-sized hand. I can fit a ninth comfortably. I can do some tenths, but some of his pieces I can't play. Well, you can roll them, but even so. And another thing is that he did a lot of imaginative things with the pedal, particularly the middle pedal, the sostenuto pedal, which is sort of like the piano version of the human appendix. It's there, but do we need it? What do we do with it? And actually, it is there, and it is useful. It is a way of raising the dampers on a single note while you can, and you still hear that, but Grainger used the middle pedal and the damper pedal at the same time. That's not a technique that is part of the standard piano syllabus. So I'll get to that. Now, the first thing that I want to play tonight is a piece that Ronald Stevenson, who we saw in the photograph, played the day before those photographs were taken, and I was at that recital. 3 Scotch folk songs arranged by Grainger from the collection Songs of the North from the late 19th century. And this is Ronald's setting of it, and he reproduces Grainger's original manuscript, and then it's printed and engraved with a lot of Ronald's peddling, which I don't agree with all of it. There are 3 songs. Will ye gang to the Highlands, Leezy Lindsay? There's the first one. The second one is Mon Nian Duv, which means my dark maiden. And the third one is O Ginai War Gaidi Rins, which Gaidi is Baron in Scotland. And this is, in this short suite of songs, you kind of see the 2 polar aspects of Grainger's personality. You know, with Robert Schumann, he had this dual muse, Florestan and Eusebius. Of course, Robert Schumann was bipolar. Grainger was not bipolar, but this kind of demonic, impetuous side and this peaceful, quiet, romantic side. With Grainger, you have his pieces kind of divide into these rollicking, foot-stomping, extremely rhythmic driving pieces that are variations in dance tunes. And on the other side, you have these very quiet, rhapsodic works that are equally characteristic of Grainger. These songs encapsulate both. The first 2, I'm going to take these off now, are the quiet, and the third one is based on a tune called the Hessian March. So that sort of explains what that is. So the da-da at the end was something that Mr. Stevenson added, but it was something that Percy often did. I call it the iambic cadence, in the sense of iambic verse and iambic pentameter, ba-bum, 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 da-da. It's actually musically called the Scotch snap, and that's evident throughout this piece, but Grainger did that a lot. Da-da-da, da-da, bum, da-da-da, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. So that was characteristic, and in fact, he does it, let me just pull this out very quickly. He wrote a piece called Scotch Strathspey Reel. I'm just going to play a little bit of this to demonstrate the Scotch. So, and that rhythm appears in some of his other works as well. But you may have noticed, I made a mess of some of these chords, but the voicing of the chords gives it's not just this block chords, it's what's inside. It gives a sense of this kind of skirling, reedy quality that you might get in a bagpipe, that sort of thing. And he likes to roll these chords. He likes this, which I think to me is the second, third, fourth, and fifth harmonic over the fundamental, and it's just the way he thinks. So let's move on to the next thing, and I'm going to play a piece that is something of a stepchild in the Grainger repertoire, because it generally isn't a featured piece. And Stuart Manville, Ella's husband, hated it and said, don't play that piece. So, it's called Harvest Hymn. It's short, but a lot happens in it in a short space. It's almost, it's a little uncharacteristic because it's almost in a sonata form shape, A, B, A. There's an opening section that is in a kind of chorale prelude style with, he tries to evoke the sound of an organ or a harmonium, and then it goes into a middle section where you're going into all sorts of unexpected harmonic and chromatic directions, and it sounds like chamber music or a small orchestra. And then the recapitulation is a big tutti, as if the harmonium is joining in the orchestra. But like most of Grainger's pieces, this piano version is something that he wrote after he'd already written it for all these other instruments. And he called it dishing up. He dished up for the piano. It says that actually on the score, as if he were a short order cook. And so Harvest Hymn is always kind of reminds me of the painting Millet's The Gleaners, the harvest. Now, pianists have a natural bias toward bringing out the melody at this side of the right hand and the accompaniment at this side of the left hand. What Grainger does is he paints all the colors in between and asks you with your other fingers to bring out the melodies, which I was trying to do in that piece. But that's very characteristic of his style. Now, let me just catch up with my own script here and see where I am on the photographs. Hello, hello, hello. All right, we did that. Yes, I want to show a couple more photographs before I get started on the next piece. Well, all right, that's a picture of Grainger when he was obviously quite youthful. He's one of the most photographed composers in history. There are just so many photographs of him at every stage of his life. And I should say he was a compulsive self-archivist from childhood. And his mother, he was really raised by a single mother. I mean, the father, John, was a highly regarded architect in Australia, but he was a bad husband. He was a philanderer, and he gave his wife syphilis, which wasn't very nice of him. And so he left the family, and Percy saw his father only a few times for the rest of his father's life. But his mother, Rose, basically raised him single-handedly and effectively homeschooled him. They didn't have the term then, but she tutored him privately. He never really went to school until he went to the Hoch Conservatory in Frankfurt, Germany in 1895, 1896. And he was there for 4 years. He didn't like it. He didn't like anything German. He didn't like sonata form. He didn't, all right, so. But he made all of his lifelong musical friends there. It was called the Frankfurt Group. Cyril Scott, Balfour Gardner, Roger Quilter. I'll say more about that later, but moving on. That's the Grainger house in the early 1930s. This picture was probably taken around 1932 in White Plains. And that's Percy and his mother, Rose. Now, his mother, Rose, died in 1922. She was a suicide. As I said, her husband gave her syphilis. I presume he eventually died of syphilis himself. He died in 1917. And in those years, there were no antibiotics, and it was a curse, and it would you'd have it for years, and it would slowly get worse. And so Percy was responsible for her support, and she was his first piano teacher, as this photograph suggests. But later on, when he lived in England from about 1901 to the beginning of the First World War, and that's where his career really started. And he came to America and lived in the city at first in an apartment somewhere around 57th Street, supposedly right next door to Lionel Barrymore, the actor, or under or above him. And eventually they moved out to this house in White Plains for peace and quiet. But Rose was increasingly having syphilis-related dementias, even though she was not an old woman. She was about 60. And there was malicious threats being spread about her relationship with her son. And one day in 1922, when Percy was in Los Angeles giving a concert, she went to the building of their concert agent, Antonia Sawyer, the Aeolian building, I guess on 43rd Street, and jumped out a window. By the way, among other strange connections I personally have with Grainger, other than the uncanny experience of having an injury send me to his doctor and then meeting him later for dinner, my birthday is the same as Rose Grainger's birthday. And a member of my family also jumped out a window. Not recently, but historically. So I feel an occult connection with Percy Grainger and having lived in his house and worked there. Here he is again with his mother. He's holding what appears to be an alto saxophone, I think. It's a soprano saxophone, okay. It's a soprano saxophone, yes. That's right, because he started on the oboe. He joined the U.S. Army. Why? Well, when he fled from Britain to the United States during the beginning of the First World War, he was widely criticized as being a coward and, you know, a deserter and everything. Don't come back. And so he signed up when America entered World War I in 1917. He became a bandsman, and he was posted to Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, Fort Totten in Queens, and that's the beginning of his real career as a wind player and composer. He's actually better known for his compositions for wind band than it is for the piano. In the wind band world, he's like Beethoven. So that's the backstory behind that picture. That's somebody that looks like me. That's more recently at in the music room of the Grainger House a couple of years ago. And here I am trying to decide whether I want to pick a record or pick my nose. There's a cabinet of records there that they wanted somebody to sift through how much of it actually belonged to Percy. Percy had a record player, but I don't think he ever had a television. So they didn't have a telephone until about 1939. So what's next? All right, I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'll point out here that this picture, I think, should be in a Technicolor movie directed by Vincent Minnelli, who is famous for his color productions. It's probably from November 1950, and Percy is 68 years old. He may still have been bleaching his hair, which he was known to have done, and he's wearing his towel clothing. Yes, there was clothing made out of terry cloth towels, and there are other photographs of that where he looks like Harlequin. And the two individuals are two well-known Norwegian writers, Gisken and Herman Wildenvey. And many of Percy's friends were from Scandinavia. Anyway, I'm going to just back up. Well, I don't want to sit in that photograph, so maybe we'll pause there. Now, the next piece I'm going to play is entitled Spoon River, and which I don't know where I put the book. Well, we'll have to forget about that. Percy knew the author of the Spoon River anthology, Edgar Lee Masters. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that book. It's a favorite of mine. It's a book published around 1915. It's a series of imagined posthumous epitaphs of people in a graveyard near Spoon River in Illinois, and it gives a kind of the person's existence in poetic microcosm. And the whole gamut of human behavior is expressed, and it's been frequently dramatized for the stage. What many people don't know about Edgar, Percy liked the book so much he wrote to Masters and they became friends. And Masters, who wrote many other books that aren't nearly as well remembered, dedicated his verse drama, Lee, a dramatic poem to Percy Grainger. It's right on the dedication page of the book. I don't know if it was ever produced, but verse drama was very popular in those years. And they didn't see each other very much, but were cordial to the end of Masters' life, which I think was around 1950. Most people don't know that Edgar Lee Masters was an attorney, and he was the law partner of Clarence Darrow. You all know who that was, presumably, the Scopes trial advocate for the side of the evolution theory. Anyway, Spoon River was a tune that was sent to Masters, and he sent it to Percy, and Percy decided to make a piece out of it. So, oh, there we go. I knew that was going to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, this is an analog iPad. All right. Spoon River, American folk dance, heard by a fiddler at a country dance at Bradford, Illinois in 1857 by Captain Charles H. Robinson. When it's lived in my fingers a little longer, I'll play it better. I haven't had that much time with most of these pieces, although some of them I know. I don't know where you are, Joe Patridge, but if you're at home watching this in a live stream, some of the camera is overhead, over my head. And I said to Joe, I know some of these pieces off the top of my head, but I didn't expect you to take me literally. So my barber thanks you for providing him with a free highlights reel. Okay, so let's see where we are now in my script. What I wanted to say about the Spoon River piece is that although Grainger, as I said, was a great band composer, and he did a lot of innovations with percussion. I mean, if you listen to his large orchestra work, The Warriors, it sounds like a Straussian or Mahlerian orchestra playing at the same time as a Maori steel drum band. That's exactly the effect that I would describe. But I think his piano writing and the chordal structures are more based on string instruments and their tuning. And the string instruments are normally tuned in fifths, sometimes in fourths, sometimes a combination. And the piece, in the piece that I just played, you have, that it's a combination of fourths and fifths that he used as a kind of a drone background for the tune, which was very creative. And he also, we put the music away already, but maybe I ought to go on and just. What I was going to show was, just bring that back. at the end of the section where he puts this note in instead of just a simple tonic, you know. He puts the third in, sort of suggests that the phrase hasn't ended there, the dance is going on. And, you know, you practically have to thwack the piano at parts of this piece, which I was doing none too accurately, but next time, you know. Okay, we'll move on to the next piece I'm going to talk about is, oh, wait, I see what I'm doing here. This Colonial Song is a piece that is sort of a love letter to his native land, Australia. He was born in Melbourne, and he grew up there until he was 14 and was sent to Germany. But he made several visits to return to Australia during his lifetime. He never took an airplane. He only traveled by trains and boats, which required a really intrepid stamina for ocean voyaging. In fact, in 1933, he and his wife Ella took a boat from Denmark to Australia, and they were at sea 110 days. And it wasn't even a power boat, it was a big sailboat. You know, if you want to get away from your spouse, that's not the way to do it. He lived in the house in White Plains, but he was probably there only half the time in those years because he was a touring pianist and because he made long trips to Europe and to Australia. And in fact, even before then, when he was in Frankfurt and then in England in the Edwardian age from 1900 to the beginning of the war, he also traveled all over the place. He was in South Africa, and he was in Russia. He played in Russia in 1913, and I actually knew someone who knew him there. Kyriena Zalati, the daughter of the pianist and conductor Alexander Zalati. I spent some time with her in the 1980s, and she told me that she had met Percy Grainger in 1913 in St. Petersburg, where her father was conducting an orchestra, and Percy was the VIP guest soloist. And that he came to dinner at the Zalati house. I don't exactly know how they conversed, because despite Percy's polyglot mastery, I don't think he ever took up Russian. But Kyriena remembered that he was always running after streetcars. Well, that's what he was doing the rest of his life. He was known as the pianist who jogged. And nobody jogged in public in those years. I mean, I had an elderly relative who told me that in the 1930s, if somebody was seen jogging around the Central Park Reservoir, people said, oh, that's a prize fighter. He's training for his next bout. And there certainly would be no women jogging. So when Percy jogged, and he did in public, and this persisted until, you know, in America in the 30s and 40s, sometimes he would be picked up by the cops. And it gave rise to a lot of myths about him, which I'll discuss later, the running pianist. Anyway, Colonial Song is his Valentine to his native land. His feelings were a little bit soured by the time he made his last trip there in 1955 and 56. They had the Olympics in Melbourne, Australia in 1956, and you would think they would welcome him as some kind of, you know, native son come home. They ignored him entirely. And he was hurt by that and the changes in the architecture after the war. But he had a lot of relatives in Australia on his mother's side that he supported. And one of the things about Percy that's fascinating is what a fabulous breadwinner he was throughout his life. He seems to have weathered the stock market crash with a surplus of cash, because in the 1930s, he built his own museum out of his own pocket in his native Melbourne. It's still there, the Grainger Museum. He spent maybe 2 years out of the 1930s in Australia. I found a letter that he wrote. Most of his letters are in the Grainger Museum, but there are a collection of letters that he and his wife Ella wrote to a man named Pulteney Bigelow in the New York Public Library at 42nd Street. Pulteney Bigelow was a Yale graduate, lawyer, and travel writer 100 years ago and more. He was born in the 1850s and he died in the 1950s. He lived to be almost 100. And he was a little bit of a notorious character because he was friendly with the German Kaiser. I don't know about World War II and that business, but Percy wrote Pulteney Bigelow a letter in 1937 that I found and I photographed, where he lays out all of his finances. And in this letter, he says that in the 1930s, at the height of the Depression, he was earning in royalties alone the dollar equivalent, adjusted for inflation, of $200,000 a year. And that was just from royalties, not from pianist fees or teaching or whatever else he did. And he made more money than that during the 1920s when he was in his headliner stage as a concert pianist playing Carnegie Hall and Aeolian Hall in New York. So anyway, I'm digressing rather far, aren't I? Okay, let me see if we can get through this. Colonial Song. Now, it's a very sentimental piece, and it has to be played with sincerity, otherwise it sounds like kitsch. The melody goes all over the place. It's almost entirely chordal. Which note in the chord is the melody? You have to find which is the Hauptstimme. You know, all right, here we go. quickly point out some of the effects. At the very end, when I was holding what seemed to be a long fade out, what was happening is very creative. First, he has these, obviously the chords are all rolled. That's a C sharp dominant seventh for those of you who are musicians. And then you're supposed to keep the pedal down while you change to a completely different harmony, a C7 flat 9, which is ungrammatical in terms of classical pedaling. You're blending two different harmonies. Then you raise the pedal and go into the E major. Okay, that's held by the pedal. He says, press down keys without the hammer striking the strings like that, and then let the pedal up bit by bit, not all at once. And that's supposed to be remove the notes from the chords one at a time. In the orchestra version, all the instruments are holding those last tones, and then one after another drops out until there's just somebody singing or I forget exactly. So he's trying to recreate the orchestral effect on the piano. And also the middle pedal is used earlier in this piece when he first starts doing this at the end. He wants you to hold those notes with the middle pedal, and then it's a very subtle enriching effect, and that's the sort of thing, because he puts the notes that are sustained by the middle pedal in the middle of the texture. He doesn't put it way down in the bass where people might think logically that's where it should be. These are the kinds of ingenious things that Grainger did in his piano writing. Okay, let me see where I am on my script. I hope I'm not confusing people too much. I call that effect where he's blending completely unrelated chords without lifting the pedal, run-on pedaling, like a run-on sentence. And there's another example of it, very briefly, just a couple of bars, at a piece of his called the Jutland Medley. Jutland is the upper peninsula part of Denmark. It's a climax of one of the sections. It goes. Then you're supposed to lift the pedal, and with your fingers still down on the chord, you hold them with a sostenuto pedal so they're still sounding when you go into the next thing. I mean, it's a subtle effect, but it's very imaginative, and this is characteristic of his piano. Nobody else would think of that. Let's see, what is my next piece? Oh, The Knight and Shepherd's Daughter. Okay, all right. Let me see where I am on my. All right, I'm going to show some more photographs, and we'll set that up. We were last on the Wilden vase and Percy from 1950. Now that is a painting done by Ella of Percy and his towel clothing that I mentioned before, and there are also photographs of him in that getup, quite a few of them actually. But she had a sort of a pre-Raphaelite approach to painting. And Grainger himself described his own aesthetic as pre-Raphaelite in one of his many writings. He was an extremely prolific writer, thousands of letters, they were all saved, autobiographical essays, memoirs, and it's just a huge paper trail. Now, why am I showing this photograph where he just seems to be wearing, well, he's wearing white duck trousers. And that's what got him in trouble when he was jogging in public, because people didn't wear white duck trousers in those years. It was just considered, men wore hats and shirts and ties in public, and women wore dresses and that sort of thing. I'm trying to find where oh, well, I'm not sure I can exactly find my footnote on that. So, here he is, more formally dressed, And it's an interesting fact that in his later years, he seems to have often worn a three-piece suit. I don't know if it was because he was losing weight and he felt cold, but there he is. He doesn't have a leg to stand on. This is probably in Cincinnati, Ohio. Yes, because there he is again. The woman at his left is a pianist named Dorothy Payne. I met her. She came to White Plains. She was a student of his and the leader of music activities in Cincinnati during those years. And she wrote a memoir about him also. This is probably from the 1950s. And here he is wearing his white duck trousers on a university campus with a little-known composer named Arthur Fickenscher, whom Percy championed. Arthur Fickenscher was a pioneering microtonal composer, but he wrote tonal microtonal music, shall we say. And Percy thought he was an important composer. Fickenscher died in 1954, I think, so that has to set the date of this photograph. Now, this woman is, I earlier made reference to Ella having a daughter out of wedlock. This was her illegitimate daughter, Elsie, or Elsa. Her name was actually Elsa Bristow because she married Robert Bristow, but she spent a good deal of time living when she was younger with Percy and Ella, and Ella always introduced her as her niece because you didn't say, you know, the stigma for illegitimacy was overwhelming in those years. So she was Ella's niece, and she became kind of a de facto stepdaughter to Percy, and she married Robert Bristow. I never met Elsa, and one reason is probably, as she is again, around 1950, after Ella died in 1979, there was a big dispute over Grainger's estate, and there were different wills produced. And one, Ella, the wife, the widow, had a will which purported to make her husband Stuart the executive of the estate, and Elsa and her friends had another will claiming that, all right, it was a nasty business, and Stuart Manville won the lawsuit eventually, and there was a rift in the Grainger Society, and all the people, many of the people that I first met there who had been his friends, Dr. Nygaard, Burnett Cross, and several other people that I could talk about but at length, but maybe I shouldn't right now. They resigned. At that point, I became a board member, and I was still quite young, you know. I mean, I was a kid compared to these people. We're going back 40 years. I was in my salad days then, as Shakespeare said, when I was green with judgment. Now I'm in my crabgrass days. So let me see where I am on the photographs. Okay. Now, the next photograph is very interesting. What's that doing in this group? Well, that is one of Ella's lovers, pre-Percy Grainger. She had a long liaison with Prince Ieyasu Tokugawa of the Tokugawa dynasty of Japan. He was an international diplomat in the Pacific, and she was close to him. I mentioned earlier that she had been, it's not a nice way of putting it, kept by Leverton Harris, the British MP, who died in 1926, and then she met Percy, married Percy, but she stayed in touch with Tokugawa through the Second World War, which is very interesting because who were we at war with in the Second World War? He was sitting in the Japanese imperial diet of the Axis power, the Tojo regime. And they apparently exchanged correspondence, which must have passed through the censor. But I read a letter that Ella wrote to Pulteney Bigelow, the guy at the New York Public Library. And Ella was aghast at what was happening in the war, so she certainly wasn't on Japan's side. And there is a persistent story that she may have used influence through him to help get some POWs released. It's totally unsupported and undocumented. It's apocryphal, but it has been said. And in fact, it was repeated by Another friend of Percy's that I met in my early days, Emmanuel Tarshish, who was the longtime recording secretary of the society in later years, and he had visited Percy and Ella regularly in the 1950s, and he told me that story. I got to know him pretty well. He died in 1988. Okay, so the next music we're going to play is one of the few pieces that Percy wrote and conceived originally for the piano. It's not a version dished up from his orchestra version of this or that. It's another folk song. It's called Knight and Shepherd's Daughter. I'm having some problems with the focus of these glasses, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I don't know if I should switch to the other glasses or not. All right, let's give it a try again. No, I'm not sure what's going on. One moment, ladies and gentlemen. My eyes change a lot nowadays, and I'm not sure, if you can't see the notes, you can't play them. I don't think that's going to make enough of a difference. These are my Clark Kent horn rims, and I want to be Superman, not Clark Kent. And these are my swimming goggles, appropriate because I'm sinking as I'm playing some of these pieces. Okay, give this a go. I'll point out a few things about this piece. Obviously, he loves to roll the chords, and that's characteristic of his writing everywhere. In the section where he does this, he writes, slowly harped. He called that harping. Tenderly, I'm reading from his score, tenderly like an Aeolian harp with somewhat gusty variations of sound strengths. That's a mouthful. So, some Grainger's scores are so closely marked with nuanced expressions. It's like Mahler's orchestral music. You still have the liberty to do some things. These very strange contrary motion grace note figures at the end. That's the sort of thing he would come up with. There's something else I wanted to say here. Yeah, another cute thing that he does is when he's doing this figure, this note is on every chord. It's an ostinato. Now this piece is written in E Dorian. Dorian mode is not a major or minor scale. You musicians know that it is a different way of organizing the scale. It was very commonly practiced in pre-Bachian music and in folk music of all eras. It even comes up in rock music. It's the same as playing a scale on the note D and with no sharps or flats. Now, if you started on E, you have to raise the sixth note as it is in the... So he writes in the key signature 2 sharps, even though the root is on E, which is E minor is 1 sharp. That's a little shop talk for some people, but it's a cute little touch, The harmony keeps changing, but the note is the same, and it's not the root note; it's the 7th note. It's the 7th. He actually did that also in one of the pieces I played earlier where I made a mess of it, Spoon River. This note is played. So he likes to do that with top notes and have the inner line carry the melody, which, you can see how he changes registers very quickly, and the textures change, and the chords themselves, they're not block chords, like you'd get in Rachmaninoff. Yeah, pianists know what I'm talking about. Or in Brahms, or Schumann. Grainger, every chord is a singleton, and he keeps changing the positioning of the voices. So it is, these pieces, I sat in my fingers for a long time, I'm sure it's quite obviously aware, it's quite apparent, but it's a challenge because you have to have your marksmanship is severely tested. And at the same time that your finesse and your nuance of touch are tested, and your pedaling is tested. And I'll get to an example later where both pedals have to be coordinated simultaneously. I don't know if I'm coming over this microphone that clearly, guys, because if I put my chin down, I can hear myself on the piano. Can people hear me clearly? Yes. All right. I'm trying to project. Okay, so that's Knight and Shepherd's Daughter. Thank you, Jung. Let me see where I am here. We don't need these. I'm sorry to be a little discombobulated with my planning here, but I'm trying to cover all the bases. And for the next, I like that ostinato effect, da 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 da. And he wrote an entire piece called "The Immovable Dough," which would have been a great title for Homer Simpson, but where you hold one note down for the entire piece, and you play. Well, all right, I'm not going to play the piece, so let's leave that out of it. We're going to move on to one of Grainger's colleagues for a change of pace. Cyril Scott was one of his close friends. 100 years ago, Cyril Scott was a very reputable and well-known composer. He's kind of fallen out of favor more recently, but he was considered the British Debussy in some circles. He wasn't exactly that, but he was actually quite a prolific composer, even though he's best remembered for his piano music. He wrote in every form. He wrote lots of symphonic music, operas. He also wrote lots of books. He was a naturopathic guy. He wrote books on the occult. I think he wrote books on marriage counseling. I mean, this guy was everywhere all at once. And he was a little older than Percy and outlived him by about 10 years. And when John Bird, who was one of Percy's biographers, the principal one, I suppose it's fair to say, started his research in the late 1960s. John told me this story. I've met him. He's come to New York a few times, not recently. The first person he interviewed was Cyril Scott, who was still alive. And the first thing out of Cyril Scott's mouth was, well, you know about his sex life, right? That's a whole area that I'm not going to touch right now. But so Cyril Scott, the pieces I'm going to play, Percy actually wrote an endorsement of one of them, if I could find where I quoted it in my notes. In a 1958 letter, he said, if we want an example of the magical power of Cyril's chord skill, examine his treatment of All Through the Night in his British folk songs. I'm about to play All Through the Night. And after that, The Wild Hills of Clare. Now, All Through the Night is a familiar tune. It's a Welsh folk song that's often sung as a Christmas carol. Cyril Scott changed the chords almost more than Percy did. It's almost like it's a lap dissolve from one chord to the other. And by the way, I want to dedicate these pieces. I forgot there was someone else I wanted to dedicate earlier, to the memory of Vincent Leonti, who was a board member of the Grainger Society for about 10 years. He was an esteemed member of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra in the viola section for over 30 years. And he was a conductor of a Westchester Youth Orchestra. He had a chamber series in downtown White Plains. He did all these things. I'm an opera goer, and I used to see him when I went to the opera during the interval. Sometimes I would go to the orchestra pit. And in the spring of 2020, we were planning, I'm not on the Grainger Society board anymore, so I can't speak to what's going on now. But at that time, we were planning a recital on May 3rd at the Grainger House. Vincent was going to play the viola. A very, very fine pianist named Richard Masters was going to be the pianist, and I was going to be the third wheel on the harmonium. And I spoke to Vincent after the performance of Flying Dutchman, March 10th, 2020. I was there. It was the second to last night the house was open. They closed for COVID. And we were talking about, well, we might have to close. We might not be able to do the May 3rd concert because of COVID. 3 weeks later, Vincent died of COVID in a hospital on a ventilator. And I didn't even know until after it happened. He didn't answer email, and he always answered email. I knew something was up. An extremely nice man. So I still remember him. All right, this is All Through the Night by Cyril Scott. It's hard to shift gears from talking to playing. Claire, another British melody by Cyril Scott. There's a lively third song to the suite, but I didn't think it was appropriate for my intent there. Okay, I want to show one other picture here. This is Percy trying to strum the guitar. He didn't play the guitar, but he wrote for it creatively in some of his orchestra pieces. But the reason I'm showing this is from the 1930s. You can see the automobile in the background. That's the veranda of the Grainger house in White Plains. The next piece I'm going to play is Percy's arrangement of a George Gershwin song, Love Walked In. And he does many miraculously ingenious things to bring out the song, pianistic devices. I'll comment on them after I play, but there's one I'd like you to look for, which is a unison tremolo on the piano playing the melody. Now, what could that be? Well, you'll have to find the magic square when I play the piece, so to speak. So let's see, how are we going to do this? All right, let me move this over here. Oh, yeah, that's right, we're going to, okay. quickly point out that the unison tremolo, which you probably figured out, is this business. That whole bit. They're not all unison. Some of them are intervals. Now, but some of it was. Now, you know, there's no finesse way to do that on the piano. When you're doing a repeated note, the same note, generally the pianist is, there's a 3-2-1 fingering. You alternating hands is really sort of awkward, you know. Maybe in the Ravel's Alvarado. That possibly could be done there, but usually it's not. So it's sort of a stroke of genius to come up with this effect, which is almost a little too rich. It's almost vulgar. And you know, consider that on other instruments, what is he trying to suggest by this? You know, on a trumpet, you can alternate valves and play the same pitch, and that gives you sort of the same sort of thing, a unison tremolo effect. On the harp, you can't pluck the same string immediately after you've plucked it. You have to do a different string. So the way the harp is tuned, adjacent strings can be tuned to the same pitch. So like E sharp and F natural, different strings, and you could do that on the harp. Of course, on a bowed string instrument, you have an open string and a stop string that could play the same. Well, I'm getting far afield now. But what I think he was after was a mandolin, the sound of a mandolin. A mandolin has that characteristic, which is because there are two parallel courses of strings on a mandolin that are tuned to the same pitches as a violin tuning, a G, D, A, E. And the player with a finger or plectrum strums both, so you get that sound. To me, it's a mandolin sound on the piano. I don't know if he thought of it that way, but that's the sort. And now the other thing being, he's using the sostenuto pedal, the middle pedal, and the right pedal at the same time. And at the very end, I'll just play it just briefly again. The damper pedal and play these notes and hit the sostenuto pedal, and then you do this, and then you put the damper pedal down while you already have the sostenuto pedal. Look, Ma, no hands. You hear the sostenuto, and then he continues. Now, why is that still ringing? Because it doesn't normally ring that long, because the chords that he's doing in between will hit that note, and will silently give it the hammer a second kick, so it's continuing to vibrate. It's a really clever trick, and he does that in several pieces, actually, not just in this piece. There are pieces by Grainger where, effectively speaking, he wants you to do all three pedals at the same time, which is physically impossible unless you're a 10-limbed Hindu god. What makes it even more amazing is that later in life, he designed a music roller to turn the pages. You know, he foresaw the iPad by 75 years. And this device is actually on film. Unfortunately, I can't show it to you because it's his only live television appearance. It was on BBC television in 1957. And it can't be uploaded to YouTube. If it did get uploaded, I'm sure the Beeb would tear it down. But Percy is 75 years old, and he's not well, but he plays Grieg, and he demonstrates the music roller. It had a fourth pedal attached over here to move the pages. So how he was able to do all that with the feet, don't ask me. But that was the way he thought. He was very clever that way. Now, let me see where I am in the photographs. What number piece are we on now? This was 7. So 8 was, okay. The next piece I'm going to be playing is another folk song adaptation. It's not a piano original. In fact, it's just the opposite. An English folk song called The Merry King. I'm having vision problems. I don't know what's going on. How are we doing this? Okay. She's a real virtuoso at this, believe me, and probably plays the piano much better than I do. The Merry King is an English folk song from Sussex, England, taken down by Grainger from the singing of Alfred Hunt in 1905. Percy went around the country when he was living in England with a portable gramophone that would make an impression on a wax cylinder. It was that era's version of a tape recorder. He would ride on a bicycle, and he wanted to hear the folk singers in their native habitat, and he would record them on these cylinders, and then he would notate them with all sorts of, being accurate to the way they sang, with all their vocal ornaments and irregular meters, and he would transcribe that. And then he would write these glorious enriched harmonic versions with enriched harmonies. It took him a while. With the Merry King, I'm reading from his score. It says, sketch for chorus about 1905, worked out for chamber music. He says room music, that's Graingerese for chamber music. Late 1938, dished up for piano solo 1939. He had originally collected the song in 1905, so it was the distillation of decades of thought about this. I think this is one of his most beautiful pieces, but it is difficult. And he has a section where he says, players with small hands may leave out the second verse. Usually he gives an ossia for small hands. He doesn't even bother in this case. And I'm going to play it anyway because I'm a fool who rushes in where angels fear to tread. And I will roll the chords, probably inaccurately, but just to give a sense of it. And in fact, you know, later on in the piece, there are like 5 variations of the tune. He says, slower but very wayward in time, asterisk. And then the asterisk jumps to a second expression box that says, take plenty of time to move across the keyboard. So if you thought I was dilly-dallying. So, you know, at that point, I'll probably rip out my phone, call DoorDash, and order a sandwich or something. We'll just sit here and take a put. Okay. So you're going to turn. say, one of those sections, you're playing the melody in the bass where the right hand and the upper part of the left hand are doing a really polyphonic texture. It's very hard to manage. And he also does the business about the sostenuto pedal and the damper pedal at the same time at the end of the piece. You're holding that with the middle pedal, then playing. So, because the arpeggio strikes the note that was originally held by the sostenuto pedal, the note continues to sing, as I explained in the other piece. Same thing here. I've never seen any other composer do that, actually. It's not, I mean, there are a lot of works for the piano where it could be used, but it isn't used. It's probably not workable in Debussy. It's probably not what he had. You know, in the second book of Preludes, Debussy, he has, most of the pieces are written on 3 staves, and there are parts where there's a long sustained note tied over many bars, and in theory one could do what Grainger does, but the rest of the piece, the rest of the texture doesn't really accommodate that. Anyway, so I'm going to play another short folk song piece, The Nightingale and the Three Sisters, which is from his Danish folk song suite. Let me just catch up with myself and see where we are here. Okay. And there's one very special effect at the end of this piece. It's not a long piece, so here we go. Again, it's originally for orchestra. This is an addition that he made after the fact. Thank you. The effect that I was going to point out is what I just played at the very end. Now, it's a swell, which means it goes from one dynamic to another and back to the first, like a sforzando piano or piano forte, then piano. You can do that on a bowed string instrument. You can do that on any wind instrument. You can't do that on the piano. Once you strike the key, it's not going to get louder or softer, except if you're Percy Grainger. He decided that if you do a certain kind of a tremolo, you can go from soft to loud to soft, which is what he has at the end. Now, the editor of this edition marked a pedal, the damper pedal. I don't do that because if you use the damper pedal and you're doing this, you just hear a blur that you can't control the dynamic level. But if you're pressing the chord and holding that with the sostenuto pedal, then your fingers can make that sail over the background and can soften. Anyway, that's my interpretation. So, all right, I'm going to play one more piece, and then you can be rid of me, or we can talk some more. This is Grainger's most famous piece, and it was, for him, what the C-sharp minor prelude was for Rachmaninoff. I just want to show you one more photograph. This is, if I understand it correctly, Percy's honorable discharge certificate from the U.S. Army. Or is it? I think it is. Anyway, it refers to him by his given Christian name, George, believe it or not. His middle name was Percy, and obviously that's what he adopted for the rest of his life. While he was in the Army as a bandsman, he dished up the tune that became Country Gardens. He had already sketched it out, and he made his piano version, and that became his bestseller. It became an annuity for him, that and some of his other lighter pieces. And he got so sick of playing it that he often would introduce it on a radio appearance. For instance, I've heard this from 1930s radio, that he says, the English country garden is a vegetable garden. So when I play this piece, you should think of turnips. So when I played, you can think of parsnips. I don't know. Now he played it, there are different ways to play it, of course. He played it in a wild, almost feral way. So I don't know if I can get away with doing that the way I've been playing tonight, but we'll see. We'll try. There was a Scotch snap at the end again. Da-da! And when I'm doing this business, he writes in the music, violently wrenched. Whereas he wrote in the Aeolian harp section, I read that sentence, like a gusts of wind. I mean, if I played it any more violently wrenched, I'd have to go to the hardware store to do it. So, but, there are different ways of playing this, and they're all valid. He made some arrangements of it for orchestra for Leopold Stokowski, where he kind of made fun of the piece and put in all sorts of non-harmonic and dissonant tones and almost flatulent sounds in the reeds. It was very amusing, like a country garden with ugly gargoyles in it. But anyway, that was an annuity for him. So that is the end of my musical portion of the program, and I have plenty of other things that I could talk about. I don't know if Joe wants to conduct the interview at this point. Where is he?
He's in the country garden.
Hello?
Sure, why not?
Okay, should I stand? Apologies for all the wrong notes. I can play these somewhat more accurately, but I need more time to live with the pieces.
I have to say that.
Move back. Into the left.
Move back.
Move
I'm
back.
told to move back.
Where should I
You
stand?
should move the piano back.
Your face is starting, so
How's it now?
yeah, that's good.
Yeah, okay. I guess I won't be able to move too much.
I don't know where you want me to stand. Just
You can stand where you are,
okay.
or you can sit at the piano. I was back there doing my thing and having three thoughts. One was that I was hearing a biography of Percy Grainger worthy of John Bird, his biographer. Another was watching An Evening with Victor Borg. And another, the movie The Nutty Professor.
Oh, well, thanks a lot.
But I mean it in the most affectionate way. Actually, this was one of the most interesting events we've ever done here.
I didn't get to say half the things that I was prepared to say, but the night would have gone on too long, and it was a little bit chaotic moving from pieces to photographs to narrative. I have all sorts of other anecdotes we could talk about. Some of that you could ask me questions.
Well, I mean, your history with Grainger, but how does one get interested in Grainger to begin with? That's the question.
I knew that he was a pianist because there were records reproducing his piano rolls on Everest Records. Remember those?
I do.
In the late 60s. And then I read Harold Schoenberg's book, The Great Pianist, and in the index it said he had died in White Plains, New York, and I didn't know that. And then there was an article in the long-gone Westchester supplement, Sunday supplement of the New York Times, that Grainger's widow was still alive in the house. And I said, my parents were still living in White Plains. We're going back more than 40 years. And I haven't lived there in more than 40 years. But so I said, I must get over there. And I wrote a letter. Remember letters? Mm-hmm. And I was answered by Stuart Manville. And he invited me as a guest to attend a meeting there, which is where I met Dr. Nygaard and Burnett Cross and Manny Tarshish, and Charles Hughes was another one. He'd written an article about Grainger for the Musical Quarterly in 1937, and here we were in 1978. He lived to be almost 100. He knew Percy. Lucinda Hess, who I think is still alive, knew Percy as a teenager. She was there. So, and a bunch of other people. And Burnett I spent a lot of time with over the years. And Dr. Nygaard, later on, his second wife, Gail, was the person who deeded the life mask of Percy to the house. And I met her some years ago. And Dr. Nygaard made speeches about Grainger's personality in later years. He went down to Australia. He wasn't a psychiatrist, but he had observed him for a long time, and he had a lot of insight into artistic things. So he had his own theories of why Percy developed some of his strange habits, which perhaps we're not going to talk about here. I don't know.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. You can, it's an open book, you can find
Yeah,
it on the internet,
the John Bird biography.
or many other sources.
Well, there are many other books too, but that is quite definitive, I think, in terms of
Well, I will-
non-musical biographical knowledge.
I
of
will
Grainger.
say this in answer to your question. I mean, you know, not everybody is a fan of Percy Grainger, and that's fine. I'm not trying to, I mean, he's not my only musical enthusiasm, as you know. But I ran into a man about 30 years ago named Noah Rosoff, who was the husband of the very esteemed piano teacher Sophia Rosoff, who taught the Abbey Whiteside method. And Mr. Rosoff had been at Grainger's lecture at NYU in 1933. And I said, what did you think of him? He didn't think much of him. You know, so I mean, it's when you meet people who have been close to a personal, a historical musical figure, and get to hear their stories, it's a very compelling human drama. So,
I mean, he's known, depending on who you ask and what their proclivity, in many different ways. I mentioned him to a clarinetist friend of mine today about this lecture, and he said, oh, the band composer.
yeah, well, that is one of his well-known dimensions.
Yeah.
Lincolnshire Posy and many other pieces
Right.
for band. He became a master of that somewhat later in life, after his 40s. He wrote all sorts of original things for percussion that he isn't quite given credit for. And he did.
You should mention the free music. 'cause
Well, I
that's-
mentioned the freebies. That's a whole story. That's a whole lecture in itself. You know? There isn't much surviving free music. It was an experiment. And if he had lived longer, maybe there would be more.
Because he wrote for numerous instruments that were not standard.
Well, he wrote for
He
a lot
wrote for
of.
theremin, too.
He wrote for the theremin. He wrote for a lot of special percussion instruments that are maybe hard to find now, like the nabimba, the decent instruments they manufacture.
What was that called? The mabimba?
Nabimba. I'm not even sure. No, it sounds funny. Because in his large orchestral works, he had masses of percussion instruments, particularly mallet instruments, and he kind of was a specialty of his. But he wrote in all mediums, and he made something called elastic scoring, where the same piece could be played in different combinations. And then he would eventually make a piano version of it, which is most of what I was playing tonight, except for one or two pieces.
He should also, you mentioned this during the lecture, but it's worth noting that he recorded quite a lot of piano music that wasn't his own, including
The thing that's
Chopin
interesting
Third
about
Sonata,
his
Brahms F
recordings
minor, etc.
of Chopin, Brahms, Schumann, etc., is he takes wild expressive liberties, very huge rubatos and rallentandos, and but when he plays his own music, he doesn't do that. He plays it straight, not without expression. It's always a spring to the rhythm. It's just the consistency of the rhythm kind of drives it, and a certain poetry in the rhapsodic slow pieces as well. It's interesting, though, that he does that, because, as I said, Bartók took great liberties with his own music when he recorded it. It's almost as if he was improvising on his scores. I don't think they knew each other. They knew of each other. And
There is one piano piece of his that I think should be right in the middle of the standard repertoire core, and that's A Ramble on Love.
well, that's one of the most complex. That's a brilliant arrangement of the
Rosenkavalier.
It's a trio at the end of Rosenkavalier. Yeah, for the piano with he made a couple of recordings of that. Yeah. But his piece Jüdisch Medley is also very difficult to play, and he made a wonderful recording of that as well.
I don't think too many of the pieces are easy to play.
There's really no easy.
There is so much complexity even
No,
in the
there's
slow
no easy
pieces.
Grainger, although there is some. Ronald Stevenson simplified some of the pieces.
Not because he couldn't do it.
Oh no, he played them. I heard him play, but no, the Grainger pieces are all more or less difficult for various reasons that I described. The textures change a lot. you know, I can't go back and play it now without the music, but I mean, when he does in Country Gardens, where he's, you know, the ingenuity of pairing those two, the upper mid-range with a high treble, in my opinion, brings out more of the upper partials in the sound. It makes it a more brilliant sound. And that was no coincidence. He was very register conscious in his writing for the piano. But he makes the player jump all around. I mean, you're firing all over.
Well, all in all, a fascinating figure, a fascinating lecture, and thank you very much for doing this.
I'm delighted. I'm sorry for the wrong notes.
That's all right. It's right in Grainger's style.
Well, yes, it's in Granger's Dalbert, and yeah, but not that wrong. Although I heard a recording he made. It's a live recording, air check, of Tchaikovsky's Concerto from Detroit, and half the notes are missing. So I don't feel so bad.
But the
Usually he
style was there.
usually he was more accurate, though. Usually.
All right. So thanks again for tonight.
Thank you.
Before I mention next week, I also want to thank our page turner. That was a heroic job she did. Because this wasn't one of the easier page turning jobs I've ever seen. Next week on Sunday Evenings at Klavierhaus, we're going to have jazz. Frankly, I'm not 100% sure who the individual is, but it's apparently Edson somebody. What's her name? Edsel. Edsel, okay. So that is next Sunday evening here on Sunday Evenings with Klavierhaus. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.